I thought we have not broached this subject at all on Rising Action yet. And, we've kind of gone like full bore into what I like to call just like film culture.
Sure.
We've also talked about some books and different things like that. But this episode, we're going to kind of break off of the mold a little bit because, and I think it just kind of lined up perfectly, but I think Marvel in general, and unfortunately DC hadn't quite kept up, but I think Marvel has really done a lot for filmmaking and for how people like you and I approach movies.
Yeah.
And I think that's something worth mentioning, at least. I think Marvel movies get a lot of hate from film people.
Yeah.
And some points that the film people bring up have a little bit of merit, and some points that the Marvel people bring up also have some merit.
Sure.
And we'll get into some more of those points a little bit later. But just right off the rip, I think you're a much bigger Marvel fan than even I am. I think I really only own Civil War is the only Blu-ray in my collection right now that is a Marvel movie. So I need to step it up. But I think you're a much bigger Marvel fan than I am. So just kind of like dive into what it is just off the bat that like attracts you to Marvel movies and that separates them from other movies you might want to go see.
Yeah, I mean, like it really all stems from my childhood. I've kind of went through like phases, like being a kid. It was like I started off with like Power Rangers was my thing, and I quickly evolved into Marvel, and the animated stuff was a huge thing for me as a kid, like the animated Spider-Man series and everything like that. And then like growing up, there was just I think when we talk about Marvel movies now, it's if you're talking to your everyday moviegoer, most people assume you're talking about the MCU and think that is all one big thing. For me, it all kind of started with my first experience watching Spider-Man in 2002, I believe it was, or 2001, 2002. And I remember just being a kid, being so excited for that film and waiting in the longest line of all time, I swear, to go see that film. And yeah, my perspective is a little bit different. I do love film, and I love things like Drive, Nightcrawler, and like some classics like Goodfellas, and we're probably going to talk about more Scorsese in a little bit, but I love a lot of his films too. So there is kind of like a little bit of a balance for me, but I understand like I have an extreme bias towards these films too.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, it all stems from me being a kid loving the comics, and finally as an adult, unfortunately it took so long, we get these grand epic films that I get to go experience and kind of relive my childhood in a different way. So
yeah, I think from my perspective, I mean Marvel movies were coming out long before I was into filmmaking or anything like that. I remember Incredible Hulk came out with Edward Norton, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Of course, now you watch it back and you're like, woo, this did not age great.
Yeah.
But movies like that, and like the Lou Ferrigno Incredible Hulk, Brandon Routh as Superman in 2006, movies like that were coming out, and I always kind of thought that they were like their own thing.
Yeah.
And I think there is a little bit of a difference between kind of like our more consumable superhero films that Marvel kind of fits into.
Yep.
And then our more, like I talked about with Seth a couple episodes ago, like the Citizen Kanes, the Apocalypse Now, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Like, I think those movies are all made for a different audience and for a different reason and meant to kind of say different things.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one thing where we can kind of all come together on this, the film people and the Marvel people. Like, the bottom line is, I think we all want to enjoy movies. And I think movies have always been made for enjoyment. And people get their enjoyment out of a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah.
But I think everybody could say, Marvel movies are very consumer friendly. Like,
Yes.
they're not going to give you a storyline that makes you really think. Like, it's not going to bend your mind beyond, like, understanding. Like, I think of Interstellar, where it was like, I literally had to sit on the couch for 30 minutes after the film to just kind of be like, understanding what it was that I had just seen. And they've kind of edged more towards, like, they're funny, they're, wholesome, they're intense, they're action rich, and there's a lot of layers to them, even though it seems at times like they can like an Ant-Man, where it's like, I don't know, like, it's okay, like, I don't know what to really do with this other than I enjoyed it in the theater and leave it at that. And I think Marvel movies don't necessarily need to be parsed into something that they're not.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with what you're saying. Like I said, film is a huge thing for me. So whenever I'm talking to someone who's more of like a film buff or a film like purist, I understand where they're coming from when I hate that they trash on Marvel films and, are always trying to belittle them in order to elevate the things that they love. They both, should be appreciated by their prospective audiences. But I do understand critiques and people wanting to, in a way, separate your Marvel films from, let's say your Oscar-nominated films. Films that are meant to, like you said, kind of make you think a little bit more. And yeah, I mean, like you're talking about, really MCU films are kind of constantly pumping out 3 movies a year that,
right.
I love those films to death, but I do understand like there is a formula behind those films. It's sometimes very rare that they're very self-contained films. They're always looking at the bigger picture,
right?
Which it does end up paying off for the most part when you get those crossover films. But I do appreciate as I get older, I guess I appreciate more of like the self-contained stories, right. Or something like a Logan, which is a Marvel film, and it's like an Oscar-nominated screenplay. Maybe no, it was nominated for something, but very different.
I want to say
adapted.
I want to say it was adapted screenplay. Yeah,
sure. Yeah,
because Mangold, I think it was adapted from the comic book, and so I think it got adapted. Long story short.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. But it's tough because I feel like I'm kind of caught in the middle when it comes to these discussions where I'm like, I understand people's criticisms toward Marvel films these days. At the same time, I'm like, but I still love them. Like, right. I love them. I'll always defend them. Because even though they're not, sometimes there is a lot of depth to the characters. A lot of times there's actually some depth. But even though they're not like mind bending and sit there and make you think, or they're not films that you really have to like overanalyze or analyze at all. You kind of like, you can follow along with those films pretty easily.
Right.
They still find a way to pull some sort of emotion out of me and give me some sort of attachment to the characters. Now you could say, I'm not sure if that's, a product of the script or just my attachment to the characters from my childhood.
Right.
That's a conversation or something that I could think about. But yeah, I mean, like my overall point is that I understand, I understand why film purists may be critical of the films. But I do think like I kind of am able to look at it from like a balanced perspective.
Yeah, I think people like the film purists, like the purists will say a Marvel film is not on the level of like a Manchester by the Sea or a Nightcrawler in terms of just like film language and just the depth of tone and character study and things like that. They're not on that level, so they should not be garnering such huge audiences and making such massive amounts of money at the box office. So they're like, why can't we have these movies that are objectively or subjectively better? Why can't they be accruing the same audiences that a Marvel film would? And I think you just kind of have to know that each film has its place,
Mm-hmm.
and a studio is not going to go out and be like, let's make Nightcrawler.
Sure.
Like it's a concept, it's an art piece, and more often than not, those come from the individual, and
Sure.
and then they're brought before other people to kind of like make it happen. But ideas like that don't just come out of Kevin Feige or
Right.
like the established studios. Even Disney has had trouble with kind of like trying to freshen up, even in one-off movies with Star Wars, like a Rogue One and Solo, where it's like still a formulaic kind of thing, and they
Absolutely.
were done with varying levels of success. But I think what Marvel has done is it's completely changed the landscape of Hollywood and filmmaking,
Mm-hmm.
because they do make consistently such massive amounts of money, but it kind of like chips into the collective pot where, like before a franchise was a trilogy, like a Lord of the Rings and
Sure.
a Hobbit kind of thing. And that was from like years and years of building fandom for the Lord of the Rings before the movies were even made. So it was not like contrived out of the blue.
Sure.
You think of like Terminator, where that trilogy was, and even still like more than that, they did Terminator Salvation and then the Genesis and all those movies that were hot garbage, and the new one that just came out that I don't even know. But
I haven't seen like the last 3 of those movies.
yeah,
But
like I know they're not going to be the originals, so why bother? But a movie, a series like that with James Cameron, where it's like that was more contrived, and that was the franchise before there were an MCU.
Sure.
But there's never been an expanded universe. Like the only thing I can compare it to is there's an author in fantasy right now who his name is Brandon Sanderson, and he might be one of the most prolific authors living. He writes an obscene amount every year, but he has written several series that all take place in like a larger universe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got a name and it's got a massive following. And it's like the only thing I can ever think of that's like on the level of an MCU, where we have so many entries into the same world.
Yeah.
And they're all cohabitating, but they're separate. And it truly is a unicorn in that they were able to go from Iron Man in 2008 through Endgame and
Sure.
have a linear story that weaves itself through all of these individual, like, what is it, 23, 26 movies that they made in that, like, block?
I think it's
or
23.
23?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's, like, completely unheard of before now. And so now that that has been done, you got to think that more of those similar ideas are going to be, like, that's going to be copied. And I don't know exactly how that's going to be copied. I don't know in what way that they're going to be like, okay, maybe it's not superhero movies. Maybe it's another franchise of some kind that they're going to adapt, that a studio is going to adapt and say, okay, we're going to make a massive universe. Maybe it's a Warner Brothers in 5 years goes, okay, bear with me, but we're going to make a 15-film franchise on blank. And it will only have been able to happen because Marvel.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that changes permanently how the filmmaking industry goes about creating its franchises, but I think it at least plays a part, and it shows it's kind of like the trailblazer that says this can be done, and the question is really kind of what comes next.
I think I think you're kind of starting to see small bits of that starting in entertainment right now. I mean, you look at this is a funny example, but you look at something like Fast and the Furious,
Right.
and they're already starting kind of like spin-off films that exist, with this universe, but with other characters. And, I'm not necessarily against the idea of that, because like I've been advocating for, like, I want a universe based on like John Wick's universe. Like
That would
I
be
want
so cool.
I want spin-off films for that, within that
Yeah.
world. Maybe John Wick's not in it at all, but I would love to see more of that. Like I'd like to see a connected universe with something like that, you know? So I'm not necessarily against that happening, but I do see these like studios trying to do things like this. Cough, cough, WB, DC, and really dropping the ball on it. And, you know, when you said like the MCU is like a unicorn, it truly is. You cannot, I mean, we can't even have this conversation without talking about Kevin Feige, because he's the mastermind of this whole thing. You know, people would 10 to 12 years ago, the idea of this connected universe that Kevin Feige wanted was just too bizarre and, you know, unobtainable. And he had a vision for it, and he was able to do it and sustain it for, you know, over a decade. You know, with lots of hits, a few misses in there, but
they did one thing extremely well, is they built up a base with pillars of characters that everybody was going to pull for. So Iron Man, Captain America, Thor. I guess we can just leave it at that. But like Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and I guess you could throw Hulk in there as well, because he was kind of there from the beginning. A little bit, but those three especially, I would say it really boils down to Iron Man and Captain America are two characters that from the very beginning, you know, we were all, as a collective that was watching these movies, we were all going to pull for those characters, and we were going to watch everything that because those initial movies were so good, it was like we got hooked. So Iron Man was it was just Robert Downey Jr. Like, let's be honest.
Oh, yes.
He was so charismatic, and he just embodied that. It was like the part that he was born to play.
Absolutely.
It was so much him. And he had been kind of like his career was a roller coaster before that point. He'd had some issues with substance abuse, but you know, he was a great actor, and it was just kind of like it hadn't quite all the dots hadn't quite been dotted.
Absolutely.
And then he plays Iron Man. He plays Tony Stark, and it's all of a sudden the stars align, and it's, oh my God, he is Tony Stark. You know,
I watched like a little bit of like a mini documentary of like the making of Iron Man.
I think I watched that same one. It was
so
good.
And when they're like all talk, like Jon Favreau and RDJ are like talking, and they're discussing lines and stuff, and you're watching that, and you're like, holy crap, they have no idea what they're making right now. Like, they have no idea what this is about to come. They're focused on the character, and you know, this is what I hope Marvel continues to do, and I feel like they might be going away from this. But when they started the MCU, it was very like character driven, like developing really solid arcs start to finish. And you know, this like I have to say this first, those Marvel characters that started the MCU, those are pretty much like B-list Marvel characters. They're not your Spider-Mans, Fantastic Fours, X-Men. Like, Marvel didn't own those characters, so they couldn't do that. So they started with B-list characters, and they found a way to make people care about them. Because like Captain America was kind of a corny character for a while,
and they played into it in that first movie too.
Exactly,
like, they really embraced it, and
they made Steve such a lovable character and someone you can root for.
Yeah,
I go back to the first Avenger, Captain America: The First Avenger, and there's a few moments in there that kind of like tug at the heartstrings for me. There's one where before Steve has his like transition to, you know, the super soldier, he's having like a small meeting with the doctor, and he's like nervous about it, and Steve kind of asks like, why me, you know, why do this to me? And the doctor's like, you have a good heart, like you're the reason we chose you. He's like, you know, basically your whole life and body is about to change, and you're gonna become this super soldier, but don't change what's inside of you. Like, keep that. And I do kind of see like Marvel kind of moving away from that and being more focused on comedy and the spectacle of things. And I wish it would go back to that. One of my favorite all time like early Marvel Day moments is when it's in the first Avenger where the captain like throws a fake grenade on the ground, and all the soldiers go running, and then Steve just
Steve Rogers
jumps on it.
Yeah.
I mean, like he's not a super soldier, nothing. He's just a scrawny kid.
Yeah.
And he jumps on that, and he's like, "Everybody run!" You know, those are like really key character moments, and that's what kind of like launched the MCU into what it was. Is they made people fall in love with these characters, and then you look at something like Captain Marvel, and I'm like, it felt like they kind of rushed that film and wanted to squeeze that film in before Endgame happened, so that she appeared in Endgame.
Yep.
Instead of establishing like a really, like her arc is okay, but like you can really make somebody fall in love with that character, and it's still made over $1 billion, and that kind of goes
Marvel
to like
made over $1 billion.
It made over $1 billion, and
oh my gosh!
I think it made more than the first two Ant-Man movies combined, but.
I mean, that's not surprising.
But. Yeah, I think it made like 1.2. Yeah, it made like 1.2 or 1.3 billion dollars. But that just goes to show, like, even though that movie is like pretty mediocre, and everyone that I talked to is kind of like on it.
Yeah.
It still made that money, and I think a large part of it had to do with it being sandwiched in between Infinity War and Endgame, and people were like,
because I think people thought it was necessary to the larger story.
Exactly. And that's
sort of was, and they felt obligated to go see it because they're like, okay, if I don't see this, I'm going to miss something. And it was not like they wanted Captain Marvel. They wanted Endgame, but they just wanted to be filled in on everything.
Exactly.
In between.
They sandwiched that movie in between those. They give you a huge cliffhanger in Infinity War, followed by the Captain Marvel.
So we're just looking for spoilers
post-credit
at
scene.
that point. Yeah.
Yeah, you get the Captain Marvel post-credit scene where he pages Sam Jackson pages her.
Yep.
And then you're like, oh my god, like I have to figure out how this fits into this. Where's she been before Endgame happens and stuff like that. That's that kind of really gets us into like the main topic of the show, and it's how Marvel's really changed the movie going experience, where you have a movie that's just okay, making over $1 billion because of this grand, project that they're working on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way that
it's on a level. Shaped. It's on a level with Star Wars where if you slap a Star Wars logo on something, it's going to make $1 billion.
Sure.
I think the equivalent to Captain Marvel is like Solo, and Solo I think is a better film, but I think a lot of people would be like, yeah, I mean, it's not memorable, and so therefore it's, whatever. And it
Absolutely.
made, I think it also made over $1 billion, and it had all kinds of issues with like directors and just kind of dysfunction. They rolled it out, slapped a Star Wars logo on it, and it was instantly going to make tons and tons of money.
Sure.
And I think we're seeing a lot more of that going forward, where there's a gold rush per se of new stories, and you see this a lot with fantasy stories. So like Game of Thrones, like a Westworld is kind of in that vein, and The Witcher, where there is a need for great stories now that can be, lengthened to last 8 seasons for a TV show or take up 10 movies in a film franchise.
Sure.
We're seeing a gold rush for it now. And the reason why I say fantasy is because like the trope about fantasy stories is fantasy authors are going to write 15 books. Like I think of The Wheel of Time. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's a 14, is it 14? I think it's a 14 book series, and each book is over 600 pages. So they're all massive, and it has an insane following in like the fantasy community. Something like that could be taken, and they're making a show on Prime about it with like a huge budget and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It's going to be something people are hearing rumblings of as like the next Game of Thrones. That kind of thing is kind of going to be the norm in terms of our entertainment, because we want huge scope stories that we can just kind of dive into for years and years and years and years. And it's exciting, but it's also a little bit not, because I know that it supersedes the indie film or the auteur film,
original,
or the noir film. Yeah, it kind of is like, and we all know this, studios want to make money, and anybody who's going to put their name on a film project is going to be like, we want to make money. And
Yep.
as much as I love Robert Eggers or David Lowery, directors that are making really awesome small indie projects, they're not the future necessarily of filmmaking, which is
Sure.
sad to me in one hand, but on the other, it's really exciting because I know really awesome stories are coming. It's just like it's Marvel helped build up the steam for those things to happen for, good, bad, or indifferent.
One thing that I'll give Marvel credit for and Kevin Feige credit for is that if you look at the people that they bring in to direct these films, most of them are not accustomed to doing huge things.
Yeah.
Except for, they kind of like give these small indie directors their big break or their moment to shine. Because you look at, even though like we talked about, didn't love Captain Marvel, but the directors that they got, which is Ryan Fleck and Anna Boden, they really only did one film. It's called
Yep.
Half Nelson with Ryan Gosling. And
Yep.
that was a great film. It's just a small, like, indie film. And then you have, James Gunn, who did, like, kind of B-level horror films.
Mm-hmm.
And Ryan Coogler, his big break was really Creed. But before that, it was
Creed.
it was like Fruitvale Station before that.
Yeah.
And then you have the Russos, who were really only doing TV shows.
Commercials.
Yeah, and commercials. So I do give them credit for that, to kind of like going out and finding these people who do know how to tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing Kevin Feige has said. He's like, he doesn't care what your background is. If you know how to tell a story, we want you to be part of this.
Right.
But it
But
all
one
boils.
thing they did was like, if you're coming in, like, we want your talent, we want everything you're going to bring to, the project, but
Yeah.
we're going to hand you the story.
And make sure it fits within this universe.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just like, and make sure there's like this little Easter egg that connects to that film. And
Right.
Make sure, all these sort of things. Yeah. I mean, like I 100% agree with you. The best stories that have come out of Marvel are the ones that are more self-contained.
Yeah.
And a lot of the older stuff, because I mean, there's really not, like, recently there hasn't been a Marvel film that, like, I think The Winter Soldier was the last film where I was like, holy crap, I'm like, this is a really great story, a really great
Yeah.
character development, or character arc for Steve Rogers. I think I might have called Steve Rogers Steve Trevor earlier, if I did. Now that I think about it, because I almost called him Steve Trevor just a second ago.
Yeah, that ain't it.
But yeah, that's the last time where I felt like this is like Dark Knight level for me.
Right.
Not quite, because like Dark Knight is obviously like one of the most iconic films, not even just comic book movies. But that was like, for me, that was like Marvel's Dark Knight, where it was like a serious tone, and like you can get people into this film that aren't necessarily comic book fans. Like,
Yeah.
Somebody like my dad who's kind of like, nah, I don't really want to watch a comic book movie. He can watch that, and it's like this spy thriller, and he can really get invested in that story.
Right.
So I'd love to see more of that in the future, but
Yeah, one thing I would hear from people who weren't into Marvel movies, and I'm thinking of one of my friends specifically, was the line he would always throw at us when we were like, we'd get together as a group of friends in college, and we would go to Chili's, and then we would go to the theater whenever, like when Joker came out, we did that. When Black Panther came out, we did that. We'd all get together, and he never would go, and he would always be like, it's because I don't, like, they're not real. They're not real life, and so I can't get into it. And that kind of segues us into another thing I want to touch on is, there's a quote from, Martin Scorsese, and I'll have to pull up the exact quote, but the essence of it is that Marvel films are not like film.
sure.
I know I talked to Grayson, when that quote came out, I talked to Grayson at length about what that meant.
Yeah.
And, kind of like the ramifications of that. But like, what do you think he means, one? And then two, how do you think that kind of like represents the film community's thoughts about Marvel movies?
Yeah, I mean, like, that was like such a controversial take when that happened, because I follow so many like film Twitter people.
Yeah.
And it was just nonstop debate, and it seemed like it went on for weeks and weeks. I don't know. Like, I think everybody should have their opinion, and I love Martin Scorsese. He's a legend to me. So yeah, I mean, like, I think he means exactly what he said. It's a spectacle, like those films. However, I'm kind of like, how many movies have you actually watched by Martin? I'm kind of like, you kind of got to watch some of these before you say things like that, in my opinion. Critiquing something without actually, watching it, it's a little bit weird to me. But I mean, I get what he's saying. I think he has a right to express his opinion. And the films that he makes are like films.
Right.
So like when he says that,
It carries
I don't
some
necessarily,
weight.
I don't necessarily agree completely, but I also get what he's saying. Like,
Yeah. One thing he said in his quote that I found really interesting was that he said that Marvel movies kind of have a lack of risk. And I think that's something that I think he's right there.
Mm-hmm.
That generally speaking, Endgame aside, or not Endgame, Infinity War aside, because I think that was a massive risk.
Sure.
That aside, they're very formulaic. They've got I think you really could, if you were to plot out the beats for every Marvel film, they're all some variation of the same thing.
Sure.
And it's kind of like a hero's journey where you got, like, the first film is always the same thing. It is, the hero finds out they're a hero, rejects it, and then embraces it, gets a new suit, and kicks bad guys' butts. Like, that is the first film for all of them.
Sure.
And then as they go on, that's where you really get to see the mettle of these filmmakers because, even going back to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and like Amazing Spider-Man by Mark Webb, those films were the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the formula to a first, one-off superhero film.
Sure.
And even still with, movies recently like Joker, it's the exact same thing. It is, and if you were to just flip it and say villain instead of hero, you got,
right.
Villain doesn't realize he's villain. He realizes it, rejects it, embraces it, gets a new suit, and goes off and does villain things.
Sure.
So there's a formula there. But what Scorsese's saying is, because there's a formula, there's no jumping out of the box, finding a new way to tell the story. And I think there's something there, but I also think to an extent he's wrong because the first initial set of Marvel films gave us Winter Soldier, Civil War, and Infinity War, which Winter Soldier is not much of a risk, I think. I think it's just a story well told.
Sure.
The two risks were, for me, Civil War and Infinity War.
Yep.
And Civil War was based on a comic, and so they already had, like, the story to pull from, but they did tweak it a little bit to kind of fit current scenario.
Yeah.
But the result of that was a fracture in the Avengers.
Yep.
And while that is necessary to a larger arc, for an individual film, it's a little bit of a risk because what you have to do in order to execute it is you need to take your characters through a crucible, but the crucible is each other. And it's not an outside force. So how do you create tension within the group, but also leave it open to where they could get back together later because we know they're going to have to deal with Thanos because that's already been built up previously. So, how do you create that tension and, have an actual like climax and falling action with that tension?
Sure.
That it's like nothing can ever be the same, but it, things have to change, but they still have to come back together later.
Sure.
And then Infinity War, I mean, you want to talk about risks, like, and we knew it was going to get wrapped up, but a lot of opinions coming out of the theater after that movie came out was like, that sucked. Like, they took away all my favorite characters.
Sure.
Everybody's gone, and I don't know if they're coming back. And that truly was Marvel saying, trust us, we're going to work it out. But in the moment, for about a year, everybody was like, oh no, Infinity War sucks, dude. Like, everybody just kind of melted, and there was memes about it. Like, Spider-Man freaking melted, and you know, like Chris Pratt melted, and who's left? It was Iron Man and Black Panther. Like Black Panther had just came out, and it was such a social justice like icon film, and there was so much in society attached to it, and it was just like a whole movement for people of color. And then Black Panther's freaking gone, and we don't know if he's coming back. So, you know, you want to talk about risks, like that's huge in terms of, will our audience buy into the idea that we're going to work it out?
Sure.
It's a different risk than I think what Scorsese's talking about, because I think he's talking about like a taxi driver that is a huge risk of a film. That's like, are you even going to stick with me through this whole thing? Are you going to, you know, stick it out with this character? And it's different, but it's kind of the same thing. Like, they did take risks. They just did it differently than perhaps the film community would have wanted.
It's tough. I think, like, you know, you talking about Civil War made me realize how much of a risk that really was, because the fracture that you spoke of was the reason that the Avengers ended up losing to Thanos the first go around. And like, this was really well set up in Age of Ultron, but there's like a moment, you always saw this like differences in like,
you saw it
ideas.
From the very first Avengers movie.
Exactly. Between Tony and Steve, they had, you know, different ideas. They have the same like wants and desires. Like, they have the same outcome. Like, they want the same thing, but they have different ways of getting there. And that's what kind of developed that fracture. But you look at something like a moment between in Age of Ultron where Steve and Tony are kind of like arguing, and there's a moment where, you know, Tony's like, I wanted a suit of armor around the world. Obviously, like, Steve is mad about Ultron, and like, this is a disaster. And then Tony's he's kind of like, I'm kind of like paraphrasing or coming up with my own dialogue, but he's kind of like, what are we going to do? Like, when, you know, the threat from space comes, you know, how are we going to handle that? And Steve's like, together. And then Tony's like, we'll lose. And then Steve's like, we'll do that together too.
Yeah.
And that never happened. They never got a chance to lose together because of that fracture, which is really well set up along, you know, those few movies. So there definitely is a risk. Infinity War, I kind of like, this is where I'll disagree with you a little bit, because I think that for general audiences, that was a risk. And general audience make up the majority of the money that Marvel gets from movies. So I guess that is a risk. But, you know, someone like me, Grayson, and you probably, you knew that, they're going to come back, you know.
Yeah.
There's a reason they left like the main characters who have been around for 10 years alive, and then they took away all the new characters. You're
it felt like
these are
a
going to be
purge.
the new ones.
It felt like a purge of all the new heroes, and they were like, we're going to take it back to the basics.
Yep.
And, you know, I knew that it was going to get wrapped up, but in the moment, I'm not going to lie, I was a little frustrated and just kind of confused, and, you know, what's going to happen with all these characters that we've seen in multiple films. Like, how are you going to fix this? And it not be totally contrived and stupid.
Yeah.
That was the big thing. It was, how are you going to do this without just having like some crazy Deus Ex Machina where it's like all of a sudden magic, you know, and everybody's back. Like, I didn't want that. They backed themselves into a corner, and they had to get out of it. And I think ultimately they did all right.
Russo said, like, it's funny that you say that, but the Russos have said they like writing themselves into a corner because it really forces them to be more creative.
Good writers a lot of times will just say, they put a character in the worst situation possible and figure out a way out of it. And that's how you get great tension and conflict, and that's how you have great stories. And, you know, we've heard that from like John Grisham, who's written a bunch of, you know, mystery novels, and Stephen King is the exact same way. Great storytellers find a way to get their characters out of bad situations in a way that keeps you engaged. That's the key, because a bad writer will be like inventing some stupid way to get their character out of something, and it just immediately pulls you out of the story, and you're like, nah, no, I'm good. That was dumb.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, kind of like going back to Scorsese, I guess it's one of those things where I don't get like really all that upset about other people's opinions anyways. So I was just like, meh. I mean, like, what does it matter that he like thinks that these movies are like theme park rides? Like, who cares? I'm like, it really is not going to affect, like, because Scorsese said that, people aren't going to all of a sudden start being like, oh, you know what? He's right. I'm going to stop going to these movies. You know, it's just validating the opinions of other people. That's all it's really doing. But I mean, it's like, I love and respect him, and I love his films. So I mean, like, I'm not even mad at all. That's just my opinion on it.
We've said Marvel movies kind of have their place a little bit. Where I think you have to understand that they're separate from like film, just kind of like the quote unquote gray area that is film. But I really think that the way these stories are going to trend is towards that filmic, cinematic, auteur lens of telling the story. We saw that with Joker, where we've already got a film and a character. We've got a character beforehand that just was like mainstream audiences, and it was The Dark Knight, which was well received by everyone. But even before that, it was like this goofy, like, you know, Suicide Squad. That character was just and Jack Nicholson, for as iconic as he was just flat in terms of a character that would fit in an auteur movie. And then we have Joaquin Phoenix and that whole crew surrounding that project. And it was very different. It was a very different tone. And it got me thinking, could Marvel ever do that? And will they ever try to do that? That may be one thing they may never try to do, because they're like, we know what we are. We're never going to try and change it.
Yeah.
But I think if they would try it, that would be really interesting. And I think they did a little bit with Logan, but even then it was not like the big umbrella Marvel. It was James Mangold and Hugh Jackman really pushing for that one to happen.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it could be something that would happen, but could a Marvel film get to the point where it's being tossed around for Best Picture? Is that around the corner, or is that way far off?
I mean, Black Panther was already Best Picture nominated.
That was stupid, though.
Exactly.
That was absolutely dumb.
Absolutely disagree with that. Even though Black Panther, I think I have it like it's at least in my top 5 favorite MCU films. Maybe it was like top 3. We did a ranking at some point, but I love that film. That definitely didn't deserve to be Best Picture. I don't see at least the MCU's version of Marvel kind of going in that direction. It kind of like saddens me, because I feel like, you know, it would be cool if the MCU really found a way to have films that kind of had different tones. Yeah. And didn't necessarily like, I mean, I want to quickly go back to like Doctor Strange, and I know this is going to sound like out of left field, but Doctor Strange was a film that like went through reshoots because of the script writing. It didn't have enough comedy, so they hired somebody to come in and put jokes into the script. And I look at Doctor Strange, and like that was kind of like one of the MCU's like darker stories, where you kind of like got annoyed at the hero because he was such an a-hole. Yep. And I think he has like one of the most underrated arcs in the MCU, but there's like times where it kind of takes you out of that story because he's like telling Beyonce jokes, and it's like, you're like, wow, they really had to find a way to put a punchline in this. And that's when when we get into this conversation about like, will they try to get into like the more like art housey filmmaking for a superhero? I find it hard to, it's hard to see them doing something like that. And they're making billions of dollars, you know? Yeah. Let's say they're pumping out 3 MCU movies and they're all making $1 billion. They're making $3 billion off these films. So it's kind of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, you know, while I would love for that kind of take to be done for a Marvel movie, it wouldn't fit unless we had a character that was just so polarizing, like a Joker, that you could really do a character study. Because a lot of auteur films, art house films, are kind of like examinations of small stories, like small in scope. Yeah. And, You know, like I think of A Ghost Story or The Lighthouse, which are movies about, you know, The Lighthouse is two characters in a lighthouse going insane.
Yeah.
And A Ghost Story is about like the history of a house.
Sure.
Those kind of things, as much as I would love for that kind of spin to be put on a Marvel film, Marvel films are huge. Like they're taking place in Uzbekistan and New York and Turkey and, you know, all over the place with buildings getting crushed and, you know, it's not like they're very different. And as much as I would like for a little bit of the art house approach to filmmaking brought into Marvel, that might be all I could hope for. Like, just give me a little bit more character moments, less like with Doctor Strange. Like those jokes, I mean, I guess they were funny, but do they add to the character? Do they add anything to the story? Do they tell me more about the world we're in? No, it's there to appease audiences. And at that point, I'm like, I know this is about money, and studios will always want their money, and I get that, and that's just like a fact of life for good, better, or worse. But you know, I as somebody who really enjoys film language, like I want something that is contributing to the character, the story, the world, and when those things aren't doing that, when aspects of the story aren't doing that, I'm like, I start to tune out a little bit, even though I might be laughing at it. Like there's some moments in Marvel movies that have really made me laugh hard, but then I thought about it for a second. I was like, that was dumb. Like there was nothing.
It just didn't really fit in with what, you know, like the Doctor Strange thing. I mean, like the dude was cold. He was a jerk to his, like, not really girlfriend, but the girl who had his back, you know, through, you know, his surgery and like rehabilitation, constantly was there by his side, and then you have him like just throwing around jokes all of a sudden when he did not, from the start of the movie, wasn't into that, and you can tell that it was just like written in there really quickly. But I mean, like you're talking.
See, like with that film, with Doctor Strange, they could have taken like a James Wan horror movie take on it. Like,
yeah, I mean, you got a horror director to make the film,
right?
And you had a horror director for the second one, which was supposed to be Kevin Feige's backtracked on this. I think it was Scott Derrickson who said that Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness was going to be the first like MCU horror film.
Yep, I remember that coming out.
Like a month after that, he got fired from the project.
Yep.
So obviously there was like a difference between like what they wanted for that, which is super disappointing. But I'm happy Sam Raimi's coming on to do it too, another horror director.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like if you look at like characters that you could pull something off, like a Joker with in the MCU, I think like Punisher's a good one, and Daredevil, but at the same time, we already got really great takes on those.
Right. I don't know how you're
for
gonna,
Netflix.
Yeah, I don't know how you're gonna up John Bernthal as Punisher.
You cannot.
He was so good. It was kind of like a Tony Stark RDJ thing where it was John Bernthal is that character. Like
absolutely
everything he's played before that, it's dude. He comes on and he's Punisher. Like in Daredevil, when John Bernthal comes in as Punisher, I was like, I'm more interested in John Bernthal than I am Charlie Cox.
Daredevil.
Like I care so much more about Punisher than I do Daredevil right now.
Yeah.
And Daredevil was awesome.
The best like storytelling is when you feel conflicted about a character, and like you want to find a reason to root for them, but you're like, oh, why are you making this decision? You know,
but
and
not like Uncut Gems where he keeps making stupid decisions, and you're like,
dude,
why?
I'm like, dude, you deserve to just like
right, like. I'm not even going to spoil it, but you deserve what's coming to you. Yeah, like you don't want that, but you do want characters to make mistakes, but you want them to rebound from them.
Yeah, exactly. And like Punisher was one of those where you're just like, God, I'm like, I want you to do all these things, but at the same time, I want you to be a good dude.
Right.
And you have like the character of Karen Page trying to kind of like get through to him.
Yeah.
And she sees the good in him. It's just like a character that has a lot of conflict where he's like, he was never a bad guy. He served his country.
Yeah.
You know, he just had everything taken away from him, and it turned him into a bit of a monster, even though he was out there trying to like take out bad guys.
Yeah.
You know, obviously it just wasn't the right direction, but I think that's a character that would fit for something like Joker, but it just can't happen under the MCU umbrella. So.
Yeah, I think they've set a precedent for what Marvel movies are going to be, and whether you like that precedent or not, like they're going to continue to make more Marvel movies. And as much as I have enjoyed them thus far, I think I'm starting to get on the boat where it's like it's a little bit much at this point. But I think that's a challenge that is going to be interesting to see how they, you know, take it on, because
It's
there is
fatiguing.
fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely fatigue. As someone who's a massive comic book movie fan, I feel that way sometimes, and it is nice that there's a bit of a break right now because of COVID,
Yeah.
where it doesn't feel like you're every 2 months getting an MCU film.
Yeah.
But what I kind of like stress to people who feel that sort of fatigue is like go kind of like branch out there and go experience different stories. Like you can
Yep.
go on Netflix right now and find an hour and a half long film that's like a really good indie film,
Yep.
and you can kind of like cleanse your palate, for lack of better terms, and
Yeah.
experience different stories. I mean, Uncut Gem is just like one of the most like out there films, and so different, fast paced, constant tension,
So
and
angsty.
yeah, experience different things is what I would say, because it makes you appreciate those MCU films when you do go see it after 3 months
Yeah.
of not seeing one. So that's just kind of like what I would tell people. And for the people who don't like MCU films, you don't have to like them.
Right.
Keep doing your thing. Enjoy what you enjoy. I do wish that there was more of. I wish that these smaller films got a bigger audience, but at the same time, I'm like what you like.
Right. I think the biggest challenge going forward is and fatigue is there, and that's really tough to handle.
Yep.
But one thing they don't have now that they had when they started this whole thing is they don't have those tentpole characters that are going to carry you through, because all those
Absolutely.
characters are gone. And personally, I'm not invested in any of the new era of Marvel characters. Like, I don't care anything about Captain Marvel as much as I love Black
Yeah.
Widow. After this Black Widow movie, I might be checked out on her.
Sure.
There's just not much left other than Taika Waititi's next Thor movie. That one,
Sure.
all in for. But other than that, like, and that's Thor. Like, that's one of the original tent poles. Are they
mean-
going to build up new characters that I'm going to care about, or is it just going to be like more just a
Nah.
movie a year, and that's gonna be
I'll
that?
tell you what's happening right now. I'm starting to see like a trend of them essentially finding a way to bring back the same characters but not bring them back. So you have the Hawkeye Kate Bishop thing,
Yeah.
and then you have so you'll have like the next Captain America and Sam Wilson.
Yeah.
So you have like these characters that have been built up, but they're kind of like redoing the characters with different people. You're going to have the second version of Black Widow, which is going to be Black Widow's sister, because Florence Pugh has signed on for multiple films to take over that mantle. So you're going to see that. You're going to see Thor kind of phase out eventually, and you're going to have
Yep.
Jane Foster take over that mantle, and then you're going to have, just the same sort of character. I wouldn't be surprised, because like Ironheart is like the girl version of Iron Man. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do something like that in the future.
Jeez.
I mean, but at the same time, like you have to remember, like Marvel did acquire like a lot of assets with the Fantastic Four, which is like, that's an iconic group of characters. You have the
Yep.
X-Men. They're going to recast that
And they've been
redo
totally
X-Men.
flubbed over and over and over again. Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
Like, there's not a high bar there.
Somebody please just make a good Fantastic Four
Yes.
film. And then they have Blade, which I'm excited for. I mean, you got Mahershala Ali coming in for that.
Really?
Yeah, so Blade's going to
That's
be cool.
interesting.
That comes out in like 2 or 3 years. So there is that, but they're definitely like redoing the same characters.
Yeah.
Just with different characters.
I'll be honest, if they were to go completely out of left field, like what they're doing with Eternals, where they're bringing in completely new characters,
Yes.
something like that is going to be more interesting to me, because I really want them to build characters from the ground up like they did before. And
Yep.
I think what the studio has to recognize, maybe they haven't, or maybe they have already done this, but they've got to invest the time into those characters in individual films for us to care about them, and then in turn go pay money to see them.
Yep.
So it's almost like you've got a football team that has aging stars and they're all phasing out and retiring. Now they've got to invest draft capital in new players. They've got to
Patriots.
Right. Like they've got to figure out a way to reconstitute the team and put together a new squad for the next 5-10 years. And that takes a year or two. Like in football, that takes a couple of years. With movies like this, it's going to take like 4 or 5. And there's going to be a dead period for a few years where it's like, we're probably going to have a couple of clunkers. We might have 1 or 2 like diamonds in the rough.
Sure.
But until we get new characters we care about, it's gonna be stale.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I agree completely. It's kind of exciting, but it's also like there's a bit of nervousness when it comes to something like the Eternals.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're still holding on to Spider-Man for a little bit longer, which I'm not a huge fan of the MCU's Spider-Man, but a lot of people love him. He's an iconic character. They'll have him.
Andrew Garfield is the best Spider-Man.
Yeah. I'm gonna say like Spider-Man PS4, but he's not in the films, so
yeah.
I have to go with my guy Spider-Man PS4. But I love all the Spider-Man. I just haven't loved the MCU's Spider-Man films, but I've talked about that multiple times on our podcast. But I mean, I didn't even mention She-Hulk coming to the MCU too. Yeah, so like She-Hulk's gonna be a thing. So like I see them like bringing in new characters, and I also see them kind of redoing the same characters at the same time. Yeah. Mostly in the Disney Plus shows is where you're going to see them. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what the MCU does.
Yeah, they have a lot of opportunities. So there's one segment that Grayson and I have done quite a bit here on Rising Action.
Yeah.
And we've kind of tentatively called it Worlds We've Been Exploring. And essentially what that is we talk about movies or books or comics or TV shows we've been watching and consuming, and we just kind of go back and forth. And sometimes it spirals into a full game review like we did a few episodes ago. And it's like completely out of left field and unplanned, and, we don't apologize.
I love stuff
apologize.
like that.
So what worlds have you been exploring recently? Take us into a little deep dive real quick.
So I definitely haven't had time to watch anything new lately. But what I have done lately is I've gotten back into Halo 3, which is so nostalgic for me. It was it's like there was 3 years of my life that I wasted essentially by playing Halo 3 12 hours a day back in like 2007 to 2010.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just kind of like, I did start the campaign and I'm just like, God, this is amazing. I wish they would get back into this sort of like form of storytelling in video games. Because Halo's just been very meh lately. But yeah, I was getting into that, and then today randomly I stumbled upon this video on YouTube that had Stan Lee talking about Halo, and I was like, what? I'm like this is clickbait. I'm like, he's not talking about Halo. This is like 10 years ago when Halo Reach was coming out.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating to listen to Stan Lee talk about Halo because it relates to how he looks at his characters when he was creating those characters. Mm-hmm. And he spoke a lot about, I mean, obviously like the hero's journey, but he spoke a lot about like getting people to care about characters and finding ways that people can relate to those characters, building tension with characters. So you're like, oh, I don't know, if he's going to make it out, and you start rooting for him. So it was really fascinating to hear him talk about that, because it's like worlds colliding for me, where I'm like, Stan Lee is like, big part of my life over here, and then Halo was a huge part of my life at some point in time. But yeah, I've been getting into Halo. Love that world. Excited to see what they do with Infinite in the fall, but yeah, that's just been my thing lately.
That's exciting. I'm really excited for Halo Infinite. I played Halo 3 ODST so much in middle school. Like
Xbox Live days, man.
Yeah.
Those were the good days.
Dude, you grew, like, kids grew up on like we were hardened on Xbox Live.
Yes.
Like, you weren't a man until you experienced
it toughened
Xbox
you up.
Live.
Yeah. Like, dude,
it got real.
Luckily I did not, I got on the Xbox Live after I hit puberty, because I did not. Like, I think about all the times where I'll laugh at little kids on there and they're like screaming with their mom and they have the squeaky voice and stuff.
Yep.
Luckily I didn't have to go through that, but yeah, like I think about it all the time. Like my little brother, he plays like Fortnite 24/7. He's 8.
Jeez.
And there's times where I'm like, God, I'm like, those kids are just so mean. I'm like, he's 8 years old. And I'm like, I want to be like, dude, just unplug your mic. Don't listen to them. But then I'm like, this is going to toughen you up. And in a few years, you're going to be thankful you went through that.
Yeah, my little brother is 7. And I'm like, you're not, like, I'm just, as an older brother, I'm like, I know how much is there that you don't need. I'm not letting you touch video games until you get much, much older. Like, they're great, but good God.
I agree. I agree completely. I feel like I've wasted a lot of time on video games, but yeah. What about you? What are you watching?
So I covered my arse after the Christopher Nolan episode, and I went back and finished Memento and watched Insomnia.
Oof.
And Memento was really cool. It came out in 2000, and so seeing it's got all the stylistic choices that you would see in the early 2000s, and like colors and effects and stuff like that. But it really held up. I was kind of surprised. I expected a movie that's psychological like that. Like there's always effects in early 2000s movies to kind of emphasize psychological issues that were just really weird and like visually kind of gross.
Yeah.
There wasn't a whole lot of that. And the story was really cool. I really enjoyed that. Insomnia, I was talking to Grayson after I watched it, and it was like the most non-Christopher Nolan movie that I'd ever seen made by Christopher Nolan. It was like, this is a Christopher Nolan movie, and it has none of his fingerprints on it.
Yeah.
It was just really weird. It was really good. It was a good movie, but it was very odd how little of typical Christopher Nolan things were there. Like there was nothing. So there was 2 things I remember telling Grayson that were really odd that weren't there at all. There was no cross-cutting between different storylines, which he's done. Even if he doesn't do a non-linear story, he's going to cross-cut between different things going on. That's what made the Dark Knight trilogy so fast-paced, was there was constant rising and falling action, and it was cutting between those things.
Sure.
There was none of that. It was just very much a linear point A to point B story. And there was no nonlinear anything. So it really just felt like a good studio film, which is really bizarre because I expect so much different things from Christopher Nolan that I was like, this is odd. But it was good.
It's a little bit earlier Christopher Nolan. Maybe he's trying to figure himself out
That's what I kind of landed on. I was like, I had a conversation with a couple different people about it, and I think the consensus is he just kind of paid his dues with the studio. He kind of did what they wanted, and then in turn they allowed him to make whatever he wanted later, and it all panned out. So it's kind of like Insomnia is Nolan paying his dues. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, so it was still really good, but it was odd.
It's like I think he definitely paid his dues, especially with the Dark Knight trilogy. From what I understand, like his like meeting with WB was that I'll do these 3 films, but after that I want to be able to make the movies that I want, which now I think he gets paid $20 million a film since the Dark Knight.
He's gotten, with Tenet, his earnings are tied to the worldwide earnings for the movie. So I think he's got.
Jeez.
I almost don't want to say 20%, but I felt like I saw like John Campea saying it was like 20% of the global take.
That's a lot of money.
Absurd amount of money. Like he stands to make or lose, I guess, with COVID, like $40 to $60 million.
Or lose. That's insane. I mean, like that's the ultimate like sign of respect to a filmmaker.
Yeah.
I hope somebody like Denis Villeneuve gets there because he's definitely earned it. Yeah. He's like, for me, I think he's like on that Nolan level.
Mm-hmm. He just makes different things.
Yeah, it's like every film's a little bit different. You could definitely tell that he like leans towards the science fiction genre a little bit more. But
which is why I'm really excited for Dune, because that is right up Villeneuve's alley.
I hope it doesn't fall flat like Blade Runner did, like financially, because it was obviously like well received by critics. But yeah, I hope Dune really performs well for him. Did you ever see Enemy? It's like
No.
it's his smallest film he's done. It's with Jake Gyllenhaal.
Okay.
Um,
No,
it
I don't
may
think I've
be
seen
on
that one.
Netflix. Yeah,
I
it
think
may
we
be on
talked
Netflix.
about it briefly on his episode, but I don't think I've actually seen it.
Yeah, so Enemy, I mean, it's definitely not for everyone. But if you want a film that's going to, like, when you turn it off, you're going to be like, what exactly did I just watch? Like, you're going to be like, what happened? What does this mean? You're going to start, like, going on Reddit and, like, looking up, like, different theories. Like, that's a great film to watch if you want to just, like, have your mind melted. But it's definitely, I mean, like, it's definitely out there, and it's very weird.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, like, his choices with storytelling and the way he, God, I mean, everything about that film. I think it was shot by Roger Deakins, and like everything about that film is just amazing. And then like it's one of Jake Gyllenhaal's best performances, I think.
Really?
Super underrated.
Even more
film.
than like a Nightcrawler or I hesitate to even say it, but Brokeback Mountain, something like that.
I mean, like it's like there. Nightcrawler is my favorite performance by Jake Gyllenhaal.
Okay.
But it's definitely like it's right up there. He plays two characters, so he plays himself and he plays like a twin version of himself. It's more of like a psychological thing going on.
Okay. You know, I haven't seen the film, but I think I've read a book that it was like loosely based on.
Yeah, it is based on it's based on a book.
I don't remember. The book might have been called, I think the book I'm thinking of was written by a dude named Ken Follett, and it was called like The Twin or something.
That's interesting.
I don't know if it's based on, I mean, that concept is probably
It may be
beaten to
it.
death, but
It
might
may
be
that
that.
may be it. I remember Denis Villeneuve like talking about it.
Yeah.
And he said he basically adapted it, but kind of made it more about like he made it more about himself and what's going on in his mind.
Yeah.
And kind of like use that character to kind of like tweak the story a bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, I highly recommend it to anyone really like listening to the podcast, or if you want to watch it, Josh. It's like it's a really
I might
cool
have to check
movie.
it out. Did you see, so there was a movie that came out on Netflix that was making waves the past week. Did you see The Old Guard yet?
No, I haven't.
So I watched it and I was pleasantly surprised.
The Old Guard. So
Yeah, with Charlize Theron and
Love her.
who else is in that movie of note?
I need to save it real
I
quick.
literally don't think there's anybody else famous in there.
When did this come out?
This came out
Recent?
literally a week ago.
Okay, yeah. So action fantasy. Oh, okay. Yeah, I did see a little bit of this on Twitter.
It's got Chiwetel Ejiofor. I really hope I didn't butcher that.
No, I think you nailed it. Actually.
So it's got him. That's about it. It's a whole bunch of no names after that, but I think if you don't go into it expecting it to be the greatest thing ever, you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Okay.
It's got really good action sequences, like really, really good action sequences.
Man, Netflix been kind of like really stepping it up with their action films.
Yeah, it's not quite. It's not the level of Extraction in that
Sure.
it's not got the technical feats that Extraction does for its action, but just like the sheer brutality, and they play with like these characters are sort of immortal-ish, and so they play with that. They're not like immortal, but they're immortal. You'll have to watch it to understand what that means, but they play with that immortality, and like it changes how you would think as a soldier if you think you're not going to die if you do something.
Sure, yeah.
So there's some cool moments in there where it's like, this is really, really interesting. I don't know if anything like that has been done that I've seen. It was a cool little movie. I guess it's not really little. It had a pretty large budget, but
I'm sure
Charlize
Charlize made up for most of that budget.
She was good. I saw Chris Stuckman say that it had just enough character to really pull you through it, and there's some really good character moments in there, and the action sequences are really entertaining. The in-between moments can get a little slow, but
Sure.
it was good. I liked it.
Yeah. I love Charlize, and I'm sure she did a lot of her stunts like she did in Atomic Blonde.
Oh, yeah.
So she's amazing, man.
Yeah.
I'll definitely check that out. That sounds cool.
So that's about it for this episode, really diving into Marvel and how it has changed filmmaking and cinema. Thank you so much for being on the episode, Keenan. Where can everybody find you and what you're about and what you're doing?
Yeah, my big thing is the Comic Blast podcast. Obviously, you probably have heard Grayson talk about it at some point in time on this show, but that's our big thing. We have an episode coming out tomorrow, which Josh will actually be on. So definitely check that out, and you can find me at Keenan Creates on Instagram and Twitter.
Awesome, man. Yeah, like you said, I'll be on the episode of Comic Blast coming out tomorrow. I think this will go live later that day.
Back to back. Listen to them back to back.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Go check out Comic Blast. Leave them a rating. I know that means a lot to them. Do that for us as well. Here at Rising Action, we would love to have, leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. But thank you, everybody, for listening. You can find us on Instagram at risingaction_. You can find me on Twitter at Josh_J98 and on Instagram at JoshJohnson98. But that is it for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next week.